The June sandstorm swept across Dusty Ford like a wrathful spirit, turning the sky into a yellow-gray shroud that blocked out the sun. The wind carried with it the bitter scent of sagebrush and parched earth, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Elizabeth Edison wrestled with the goat pen gate, her dress already heavy with dust, her hair escaping from beneath her bonnet in wild strands. The animals bleated nervously, sensing the approaching wall of sand. She grabbed the lead goat by its rope collar and hauled it toward the shelter, the rest of the herd following in a chaotic rush. Her hands, already rough from years of ranch work, stung as the rope burned across her palms. The gate creaked open behind her. Through the swirling dust, she glimpsed a figure on horseback, a lean silhouette against the amber haze. The horse was skeletal, ribs showing through its dusty coat, and its rider sat tall despite the wind trying to tear him from the saddle. Elizabeth's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle propped against the barn door. Out here, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. The dog, Caesar, erupted in sharp barks, hackles raised. The rider raised an empty water gourd high above his head, a gesture of peace. His face emerged from the dust, sun-darkened skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, black hair tied low at his neck, and eyes that swept the farmyard with the quick assessment of a hawk. He wore clothes that had seen better days, a faded blue shirt, leather pants worn soft, and moccasins that whispered against his stirrups. "I'll trade my last arrow for milk," he said, his voice carrying a thin edge of humor despite the circumstances. He reached into a quiver at his side and pulled out a single arrow, laying it carefully across the fence post. The fletching was eagle feather, the shaft straight and true, a warrior's arrow, not a child's toy. Despite herself, Elizabeth found a laugh escaping her lips. The absurdity of it here in the middle of a sandstorm, with the world turning to chaos around them. This stranger was offering to barter an arrow for milk like they were at a Sunday market. "That's quite a trade," she called back, still keeping one hand near the rifle. "Most folks offer coin or labor. Most folks have more than one arrow," he replied, dismounting with a grace that belied his obvious exhaustion. He moved slowly, keeping his hands visible, understanding the delicate dance of frontier trust. Elizabeth studied him for a long moment. His movements were careful but not threatening, and there was something in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. She'd seen that look before, in her own mirror after James died. "Wait there," she said finally. She disappeared into the small adobe house and returned with a tin cup of goat's milk and a wedge of cornbread wrapped in cloth. The storm was getting closer, the wind now howling like a living thing. He accepted both with a nod of gratitude, drinking deeply. As he lowered the cup, movement from the doorway caught their attention. A small boy peered out, his brown eyes wide with curiosity. He couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with dark hair that stuck up at odd angles and a fading scar above his left eyebrow. The stranger froze mid-swallow, his eyes locked onto the child with an intensity that made Elizabeth's hand drift back toward the rifle. But it wasn't aggression she saw in his face, it was recognition, raw and painful. The boy stared back, equally transfixed, his gaze fixed on the turquoise bead necklace visible at the stranger's throat. His small mouth formed a single word, barely audible over the wind: key. The cup slipped from the man's fingers, clattering on the hard-packed earth. The remaining milk splashed across the dust, creating dark patterns that the wind immediately began to erase. He took a half-step forward, then stopped himself, his whole body trembling with restraint. Elizabeth felt her heart drop into her stomach. She'd known this day might come, had dreaded it even as she'd fallen in love with the boy the church had brought to her. "Henry," she called sharply, "get back inside." But the boy didn't move. He continued to stare at the stranger, one small hand reaching up to touch his own scarred eyebrow. The stranger's voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "That scar, I put pine resin on it when he fell at the creek, 3 winters ago." His English was careful, precise. with an accent that softened the edges of the words. The wind chose that moment to slam into them with renewed force, driving sand into their faces. Elizabeth grabbed Henry and pulled him inside, gesturing for the stranger to follow. Whatever was happening here, they couldn't sort it out in the middle of a sandstorm. Inside, the small house offered blessed relief from the wind. Elizabeth lit a kerosene lamp, its yellow glow pushing back the premature darkness. The stranger stood near the door, water still dripping from his hair, creating small mud puddles on the packed earth floor. "My name is Thomas Jefferson," he said quietly, using the name the Army Scouts had given him years ago. "But my people call me Chinez." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've been looking for my son for 2 years." Elizabeth felt Henry press against her skirts, seeking comfort. Her arm went around him automatically, protective. "This is Henry," she said carefully. "The church brought him to me 6 months ago, said he was an orphan from the mission trains." "His name is Kiyaji," Thomas said, his voice gaining strength. "It means little boy in our language. He was taken from our camp by men with official papers. Papers I couldn't read." The bitterness in his voice could have curdled milk. They stood there in the lamplight, 2 adults and a child caught in an impossible situation. Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the windows and sending drafts through every crack in the walls. Elizabeth busied herself securing shutters and checking the door latch, needing something to do with her hands while her mind raced. Henry Key had crept closer to Thomas, drawn by something deeper than memory. He reached out tentatively and touched the turquoise beads. "I remember," he whispered. "Blue stones and songs." Thomas closed his eyes, pain etching deep lines around them. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I sang to you every night, about the stars and the wind and the way home." Elizabeth watched this reunion with a heart that felt like it was being torn in two. She'd lost her husband to a stray bullet in a water rights dispute. Henry had filled that void, given her purpose again. The thought of losing him now. "We should wait out the storm," she heard herself saying. "Then we can talk properly about everything." Thomas nodded, understanding the gift she was offering time to think, time to find a path that didn't end in heartbreak for everyone. "I can help secure the animals," he offered. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. They worked together with surprising efficiency, as if they'd done this before. Thomas knew exactly where to position the wooden barriers to protect the goat shed. Elizabeth found herself following his lead as he angled the tarps to deflect the worst of the wind. At one point, the lead goat decided to make a break for it, knocking over a pile of firewood in the process. Thomas dove to catch it. Elizabeth grabbed its hindquarters, and they ended up in a tangled heap with the goat bleeding indignantly on top of them. Henry's laughter rang out, the first genuine laugh Elizabeth had heard from him since he'd arrived. As they untangled themselves, Thomas caught her eye. Despite everything, despite the impossibility of their situation, he smiled. It transformed his face, showing the man he might have been before loss carved its marks on him. Night fell hard and fast, the storm finally beginning to exhaust itself. They sat around Elizabeth's small table, sharing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Thomas told them about his journey, the false leads, the closed doors, the way hope had become as sharp and dangerous as a blade. Elizabeth found herself telling him about James, about the randomness of his death and the purposelessness that had followed, about how Henry had given her a reason to get up in the morning again. Henry dozed against Thomas's shoulder, fitting there as naturally as a key in a lock. Elizabeth saw how carefully Thomas held him, as if he might disappear like smoke if he held too tight. "I know what the law says," Thomas said quietly, not wanting to wake the boy. "I know what papers matter to white men's courts, but he's my blood. When they took him, they took my heart." Elizabeth poured more coffee from the pot on the stove, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "And what would you do, take him back to your people?" The same camp that couldn't protect him before. It was cruel, but it needed saying. Thomas flinched but didn't argue. I left that life. I scout sometimes, guide wagon trains. I saved money. I could give him a home. Where? How a single man, Indian or not, raising a child alone. Elizabeth shook her head. You know what they'd say. What they'd do. They sat in silence, listening to the wind die down outside. The storm was passing, but the one inside the small adobe house was just beginning. I won't let them take him again, Thomas said finally. Not to another mission train, not to strangers who see him as a problem to be solved. Then we want the same thing, Elizabeth replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. We both want him safe. We both want him loved. Thomas looked at her across the table. This white woman who'd taken in his son, who'd fed him when he appeared at her gate like a ghost from the desert. There was strength in her, the kind that came from surviving when life gave you every reason not to. There might be a way, Elizabeth said slowly, an idea forming like dawn breaking over the desert. But it would require trust, from both of us. As the last of the storm rattled past the windows, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. Two strangers who'd been brought together by a child began to speak of possibilities. Outside, the desert began to settle, dust returning to earth, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, a lone voice becoming many, stronger together than apart. The morning after the storm dawned clear and still, the desert washed clean by wind. Elizabeth found Thomas already awake, sitting on the porch steps watching the sunrise paint the mountains crimson. He'd wrapped himself in the blanket she'd given him, but his eyes were alert, scanning the horizon with the constant vigilance of a man who'd learned that danger came with the dawn. Coffee, she offered, holding out a steaming cup. He accepted it gratefully, making room for her on the step. They sat in companionable silence, watching the world wake up. Henry, she still thought of him as Henry, even knowing his true name remained asleep inside, exhausted by the emotional storm of the previous day. Tell me about yourself, Elizabeth said finally. Not just about what happened, but who you are. Thomas took a long sip of coffee before answering. I was born into the Bitterwater clan, he said simply. My mother's people, in your calendar, maybe 35 winters ago. I learned to track before I could properly walk, to read the sky before I could read words on paper. He spoke of growing up between two worlds, the traditional ways of his people and the encroaching presence of soldiers, settlers, and missionaries. His voice carried no bitterness, just a matter-of-fact acceptance of how things were. I was good with horses, he continued. Good enough that the army took notice. They needed scouts who knew the land, who could find water where white men saw only death. I thought, he paused, searching for words. I thought if I helped them, if I showed them we could work together, it would make things better for my people. Elizabeth heard the old pain in his voice, the weight of choices that hadn't turned out as hoped. She knew that weight intimately. I left that life after the trouble at Canyon de Shelley, he said quietly. Came back to find my wife had died of the coughing sickness. But Marie, that's what the mission called her, she'd left me Key, my son, my continuation. He told her about those precious years, teaching his son the old ways while trying to prepare him for the new world rushing toward them. About the night men came with papers, claiming the boy needed proper education and Christian guidance. How they'd taken Key while Thomas was away guiding a supply train. The reservation agent said it was legal, said I'd have visiting rights. But when I came back, they'd already sent him east for his own good. They said, his knuckles were white around the coffee cup. Elizabeth found herself telling her own story in return. I was Elizabeth Montgomery before I married James Edison. Came west from Philadelphia because I couldn't breathe in all those society rules and expectations. My father was a judge. He nearly disowned me when I told him I was marrying a rancher. She spoke of building a life with James, of dreams of children that never came, of the stupid argument over water rights that had ended with a stray bullet and her husband dead in the dust. I was 26 and ready to die myself. Then the church brought Henry Key to me, said they needed good Christian homes for orphaned children. You didn't question it. Of course I did. But Reverend Franklin had papers, official seals, and the boy, she glanced back toward the house. He needed someone. I needed someone. It seemed like God's own providence. Thomas made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. Your God has a strange sense of humor. They turned to harder truths then. Thomas had spent 2 years following cold trails, learning to read the white man's bureaucracy, discovering the shadow network that moved native children like cattle to market. They call it education and salvation, he said. But money changes hands. Always money. Elizabeth felt sick. She'd suspected something wasn't right the way Henry had arrived with so little. The vague answers to her questions. But she'd wanted to believe, needed to believe, that she was doing good. I'm not giving him up, she said firmly. Neither am I, Thomas replied. They stared at each other, two immovable forces meeting over a child they both loved. The sun climbed higher, already bringing heat to the day. You mentioned a way, Thomas said finally. Last night, what were you thinking? Elizabeth had spent the sleepless hours refining the wild idea. Now, in daylight, it seemed both more possible and more frightening. What if we didn't have to choose? What if we could protect him together? She saw the skepticism in his eyes and pushed on. You need respectability in the white world. I need help running this place. It's too much for one person. And Henry, Key, he needs both of us. He needs to know where he comes from, but he also needs to be safe in the world as it is. You're suggesting a business arrangement, partners. You help me with the ranch. I provide the respectable front. We raise him together. The words tumbled out faster now. It wouldn't be... That is, we'd have separate quarters, but to the town. We'd be a proper household. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. They'd never accept it. An Indian man and a white woman under the same roof. Not under the same roof. You could stay in the old foreman's cabin. It's only 50 yards from the main house. Close enough to be part of Henry's daily life. Far enough to satisfy propriety. Elizabeth had thought this through carefully. As for the town, they need what I have. Milk, eggs, produce, and I'm James Edison's widow. That still carries weight. And when men like those who took my son come looking, then they find a legal household with proper papers. A widow who's taken in an orphan and hired a ranch hand. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. I know it's not ideal. I know it asks you to swallow pride and play a role. But it keeps him safe. Isn't that what matters? Inside the house, they heard Henry stirring. Both adults turned toward the sound, their shared concern creating a moment of unity. I don't even know you, Thomas said softly. No, Elizabeth agreed. But we both know him, and we both know what the alternative is, courts, lawyers, him being taken away from both of us. Thomas stood, pacing to the edge of the porch. Elizabeth could see the war in him, pride against pragmatism, tradition against adaptation. She'd seen that same war in James when he'd had to accept her unladylike ways. There would need to be rules, he said finally. He needs to know who he is, where he comes from, not just the mission school version. Agreed. And he needs to stay in school, learn to read and write properly, to have choices when he's grown. I won't pretend to be less than I am. I wouldn't ask you to. Just careful. This town can be kind, but it can also be cruel. Henry appeared in the doorway. Rubbing sleep from his eyes, he looked between them uncertainly, sensing the tension. Without hesitation, he went to Thomas, lifting his arms to be picked up. Thomas obliged, settling the boy on his hip with practiced ease. Are you staying? Henry asked in his small voice. Thomas looked over the boy's head at Elizabeth. She saw the moment he made his decision, saw the father win out over the warrior. "Yes," he said quietly, "if Miss Elizabeth will have me." The relief that flooded through her was unexpected in its intensity. "Then we'd better get you settled. The foreman's cabin needs work, but it's sound, and we'll need to go to town. Make everything official with Reverend Franklin." "The minister who brought him to you." "The same. He's a good man, just trusting. If we present this right, he'll help us." They spent the morning walking the property, Henry chattering happily as he showed Thomas all his favorite spots. Elizabeth watched them together, saw how the boy had already begun to bloom in his father's presence. Thomas knew exactly how to talk to him, when to be serious and when to play. At the goat pen, Henry proudly showed off his favorite kids, explaining their names and personalities with 6-year-old authority. "This one's Napoleon 'cause he's bossy, and this one's Josephine 'cause she's pretty, and this one's Caesar, but he's not like the dog Caesar. He's the goat Caesar." "You know about Napoleon?" Thomas asked. Impressed. "Miss Elizabeth teaches me from her books," Henry said proudly. "She has lots of books." They toured the small ranch, 5 acres of scrub and hope, the well that needed constant maintenance, the vegetable garden fighting a losing battle with rabbits, the chicken coop that listed to one side. Thomas took it all in with the eye of someone who'd built camps from nothing. "That fence won't last another storm," he observed. "I know. James always meant to fix it properly." "I can do it, and that irrigation ditch needs rerouting. You're losing too much water to seepage." Elizabeth felt something ease in her chest. Having someone else see what needed doing, someone capable of actually doing it, was a gift she hadn't expected. The foreman's cabin was dusty but solid, built by James in more optimistic days when he'd planned to expand the operation. It had a single room with a stove, a bed frame, and not much else. Thomas walked through it slowly, testing floorboards, checking the chimney. "It's not much," Elizabeth apologized. "I've slept in far worse, and it's close enough to hear if there's trouble." That afternoon, they went to town. Elizabeth dressed carefully in her most respectable black dress. Thomas wore his cleanest clothes, his hair neatly tied back. Henry rode between them on the wagon seat, chattering about everything he saw. Dusty Ford sprawled along the stage road like a dog sleeping in the sun. False front buildings lined the main street, their painted signs already fading in the desert air. People stopped to stare as their wagon rolled past Elizabeth Edison with a native man and the orphan boy she'd taken in. At the general store, Elizabeth introduced Thomas as her new hired hand. "Mr. Jefferson comes highly recommended," she said smoothly to Mrs. Wellington behind the counter. "He's worked with the Army and knows livestock." "Mrs." Wellington's eyes narrowed with curiosity, but Elizabeth's steady gaze and the Edison name held weight. "Well, you've been needing help out there," the woman allowed, "especially with a young one to care for." At the church, Reverend Franklin received them with cautious optimism, a thin man with kind eyes. He'd always supported Elizabeth's decision to take in Henry. Now he listened as she explained the arrangement, his fingers steepled in thought. "And you're the boy's relative?" he asked Thomas carefully. "I knew his family," Thomas replied, which was truth without being the whole truth. "When I heard he was here, I came to see if I could help." The Reverend studied them all, Elizabeth in her widow's weeds, Thomas sitting carefully straight. Henry pressed between them like he belonged to both. "It's irregular," he said finally. "But then, so is much of life out here. I'll write a letter of recommendation, stating that I approve of the arrangement." As they left town, wagon loaded with supplies, Elizabeth felt the weight of eyes following them. By nightfall, everyone would know. By week's end, they'd have decided whether to accept it or not. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly as they turned toward home. "We're not done yet," Elizabeth warned. "This was the easy part." But as Henry fell asleep against his father's shoulder, as the sunset painted the desert in shades of gold and rose. She felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years' hope. Complex, fragile, requiring careful tending, but hope nonetheless. They were 3 broken pieces trying to form a whole. It wouldn't be easy, but as the ranch came into view, smoke rising from the chimney she'd left banked, Elizabeth thought maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the ruins of what they'd each lost. The first weeks of their arrangement passed in a careful dance of boundaries and tentative trust. Thomas rose before dawn each day, the foreman's cabin showing signs of life as smoke curled from its chimney. By the time Elizabeth had breakfast ready, he'd already fed the animals and checked the fence lines. They'd eat together, the 3 of them, before Henry ran off to play or help with chores suited to his small hands. The rhythm of ranch life created its own kind of intimacy. Elizabeth learned that Thomas hummed while he worked, old songs she didn't recognize but that seemed to make the labor lighter. Thomas discovered that Elizabeth could calculate sums in her head faster than most men could on paper, a skill from helping her father with his legal documents. Henry bloomed between them like a desert flower after rain. In the mornings, he'd follow Thomas, learning to read tracks in the dust rabbit, road runner, the side-winding pattern of snakes. "See here," Thomas would say, crouching beside a print. "This one's fresh, maybe an hour old. The edges are still sharp." In the afternoons, Elizabeth continued his lessons. The kitchen table became a schoolroom where Henry practiced his letters, sounding out words from the few books she owned. He'd taken to calling himself both names, now Henry at the table with his slate. Key when he was outside learning the desert's secrets. "Is that all right?" Elizabeth asked Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch, Henry asleep inside. The 2 names. "A person can carry more than one name," Thomas replied. "I've been Thomas Jefferson to the white world for 10 years, but I'm still Chi Nez to my people." He'll find his balance. The town's reaction came in waves. First was curiosity, women finding excuses to visit, bringing preserves or fabric scraps, their real purpose, to observe the unusual household. Elizabeth received them with cool grace, serving tea and answering questions with just enough detail to satisfy without encouraging gossip. Marie Curie, the schoolteacher who'd recently arrived from Kansas, proved an unexpected ally, a woman ahead of her time. She visited one afternoon when Thomas was teaching Henry to repair a harness. "Good hands-on learning," she observed approvingly. "The boy could use that kind of practical knowledge along with his books." "Most folks wouldn't see it that way," Elizabeth said carefully. "Most folks haven't read as much as I have about education reform." Marie replied with a smile that suggested she knew exactly what battles Elizabeth was fighting. But not everyone was so accepting. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who owned the largest ranch in the valley and had his eye on Elizabeth's water rights since James died, made his displeasure known. He'd stopped Thomas in town, blocking his path with his considerable bulk. "Interesting arrangement you've got out there," Vanderbilt would say, tobacco juice staining his gray beard. "Widow woman needs protection, but there's proper ways and improper ways." Thomas never rose to the bait, keeping his responses brief and polite, but Elizabeth saw the tension in his shoulders afterward, the way his hand would clench and unclench as if missing a weapon. The real test came on a blazing July afternoon. Elizabeth was struggling with the water pump, which had chosen the hottest day of the year to fail. Sweat dripped into her eyes as she wrestled with the handle, cursing under her breath in a way that would have scandalized her Philadelphia relatives. "Let me," Thomas said, appearing beside her. He'd removed his shirt in the heat, and she found herself noticing the scars that mapped his body, each one a story of survival. They worked together, Elizabeth holding components while Thomas made repairs. At one point, the pump handle slipped, spraying them both with precious water. Henry, who'd been playing nearby, shrieked with laughter at their shocked expressions. "You did that on purpose," Elizabeth accused, though she was laughing too. "The pump has its own mind." Thomas protested, but his rare smile gave him away. That's when they heard the horses. 3 riders approached Vanderbilt and 2 of his men. Elizabeth quickly grabbed a shawl to cover her wet dress, while Thomas pulled on his shirt. "Mrs. Edison." Vanderbilt tipped his hat mockingly. "Heard you were having some trouble out here. Thought we'd check on you." "As you can see, we're managing fine," Elizabeth replied coolly. Vanderbilt's eyes traveled between her and Thomas, taking in their water-soaked appearance. "Seems mighty cozy for a business arrangement." "Is there something you need, Mr. Vanderbilt?" Thomas asked quietly, stepping slightly forward. "Just looking out for the widow's reputation," Vanderbilt said. "Wouldn't want folks getting the wrong idea. Bad for business, you understand." Elizabeth felt her temper flare. "My reputation is my own concern, sir, as are my business arrangements." "Maybe so," Vanderbilt said, his eyes never leaving Thomas. "But the boy there, well, children need stable homes, proper influences. The court takes interest in such things." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Elizabeth's hand found Henry's shoulder, pulling him close. Thomas had gone very still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. "The court," Elizabeth said with forced calm, "has already approved my guardianship. Reverend Franklin can attest to the propriety of my household. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." Vanderbilt lingered another moment, then wheeled his horse around. "You think on what I said," he called over his shoulder. "Offer on those water rights still stands." After they left, Elizabeth sank onto the porch steps, shaking. "He means it. He'll use Henry to force me to sell." "He'll try." Thomas agreed. He sat beside her, careful to maintain proper distance. But he's not the only one who can play that game. That evening, they held a war council of sorts. Marie Curie joined them, along with Samuel Morse, the telegraph operator who'd taken a liking to Henry, and Florence Nightingale, the territory's first female doctor who delivered half the children in the valley. "Vanderbilt's been land-grabbing for years," Samuel said, his thin fingers drumming on the table. "But he's always stayed just inside the law." "Then we need to be smarter," Florence said. She'd brought her medical bag, ostensibly to check Henry's health, but really to show support. "Elizabeth, you need to be seen as the perfect guardian. Thomas, you need to be the model employee. Give them nothing to use against you." "And we need allies," Marie added. The Mexican families, the other small ranchers, Vanderbilt's made enemies. Time to remind them they're not alone. They talked late into the night, planning strategies, identifying friends and foes. Henry fell asleep on Thomas's lap, and Elizabeth caught Florence watching them with a soft expression. "He's a good father," the doctor murmured. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed simply. "He is." The campaign for respectability began the next day. Elizabeth increased her presence in town, volunteering at the church, helping Marie with the school. She was careful to mention Thomas's helpfulness, how much more productive the ranch had become. Thomas, for his part, took on extra work. When Alexander Graham Bell's freight wagon broke an axle outside town, Thomas fixed it, refusing payment. When the church roof leaked, he spent his Sunday patching it, slowly, grudgingly. The town began to see him as more than just the Indian. But it was Henry who proved their greatest ambassador. At school, he helped other children with their letters, sharing the patient way Elizabeth taught him. During recess, he showed them the desert tricks Thomas had taught: how to find water-storing plants, how to predict weather from cloud shapes. One afternoon, young Theodore Roosevelt, the banker's son, came home covered in cactus spines after trying to prove he was braver than the Indian boy. Instead of gloating, Henry carefully removed each spine, the way Thomas had shown him, talking Theodore through the pain. Henry says his PA knows all about the desert. Theodore reported at dinner that night. Says he can track anything, fix anything. I wish my PA knew things like that. Word spread as word always did in small towns. The suspicious looks began to fade. replaced by grudging respect. When Susan Anthony, the mayor's wife, needed her prize milk cow treated for colic, she swallowed her pride and asked for Thomas's help. He saved the cow, and Susan became an unexpected advocate. Whatever else he might be, she told her sewing circle, the man knows animals, and he's teaching the boy useful things, more than some fathers do. The turning point came during the autumn roundup. A flash flood trapped a group of ranchers in Devil's Canyon, including 2 of Vanderbilt's men. Thomas knew the canyon, knew the one route that might still be passable. Without hesitation, he led the rescue party, guiding them through treacherous terrain in near darkness. When they emerged, mud-covered and exhausted, but alive, even Vanderbilt's men had to acknowledge the debt. Thomas had risked his life for men who'd shown him nothing but hostility. That night, as Elizabeth tended the cuts on Thomas's hands from the rescue, she found herself fighting tears. "You could have been killed." "They needed help," he said simply. "Vanderbilt's men wouldn't have done the same for you." "No," Thomas agreed, "but I'm not them." She wrapped the bandage carefully, aware of the calluses on his palms, the strength in his fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For being who you are. For showing Henry that integrity matters more than acceptance." Their eyes met and held. For a moment, the careful distance they maintained seemed to shrink. Then Henry called from his room, breaking the spell, and Elizabeth stepped back. "I should check on him," she said quickly. Thomas nodded, understanding. "Good night, Elizabeth." It was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it lingered in the air after he left for his cabin, warm and full of possibility. As autumn deepened toward winter, their strange little family found its rhythm. The town's acceptance remained conditional, fragile, but it was there. Vanderbilt still circled like a vulture, but his threats carried less weight now that Thomas had saved his men. And in the evenings, when the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, Henry practicing his letters, Elizabeth mending clothes, Thomas carving a toy horse, it felt like something approaching home. Not perfect, not without challenges, but real and growing stronger every day. The desert had taught them all about survival. Now, slowly, they were learning about something more, how broken pieces could fit together in new ways, creating patterns as beautiful as they were unexpected. The whispers started like tumbleweeds, rolling through Dusty Ford's dusty streets and gathering weight with each telling. "The widow Edison's keeping house with that Indian. Poor little Henry. Caught between 2 worlds. Something ain't natural about that arrangement." Elizabeth first noticed the change at Wellington's store. Conversations stopped when she entered, replaced by pointed silence and sideways glances. Mrs. Wellington still served her, but the warm chattiness had cooled to crisp efficiency. "Will that be all? Mrs. Edison." The emphasis on her married name felt like a slap. "Yes, thank you." Elizabeth kept her chin high as she gathered her purchases. Outside, she nearly collided with Clara Barton, the minister's wife, who'd been one of her few friends. "Elizabeth," Clara said, glancing nervously around, "I've been meaning to speak with you. Perhaps you should consider reconsidering your domestic arrangements for the boy's sake." "Henry is thriving," Elizabeth replied evenly. "His grades have improved. He's healthy and happy. But what kind of example is being set?" Clara lowered her voice. "People are talking, saying things. Cornelius Vanderbilt has been especially vocal at the town meetings." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. Let them talk. But talk had a way of becoming action in small towns. The next Sunday, their usual pew at church seemed to have developed an invisible barrier. Families who'd once smiled now found reasons to sit elsewhere. Henry noticed, his small hand finding Elizabeth's during the sermon. Thomas bore it all with stoic dignity, but Elizabeth saw the cost, the way his shoulders tensed when groups of men fell silent at his approach, the careful distance he maintained in public, never giving ammunition to those watching for impropriety. The pressure escalated when an official-looking envelope arrived, delivered by Benjamin Harrison, the county clerk. His face was apologetic but firm as he handed it over. "Legal summons," he said quietly. "Vanderbilt's petitioned the court to review your guardianship of the boy. Hearing set for 3 weeks hence." Elizabeth's hands trembled as she opened the document. The language was cold. Clinical concerns regarding the moral environment, unconventional household, best interests of the child. That evening, Thomas found her at the kitchen table, the summons spread before her like a declaration of war. Henry was asleep, mercifully unaware of the storm gathering around him. "He's using the boy to get the water rights," Thomas said, reading over her shoulder. "I know." Elizabeth's voice was hollow. "If I lose Henry, I'll sell. I won't be able to stay here, seeing him with another family." "We won't lose him." Thomas's hand hovered near her shoulder, not quite touching. "We'll fight." "With what Vanderbilt has money, influence, he's probably already bought the judge. Then we need our own weapons." Thomas moved to the window, watching the darkening sky. "I didn't want to bring this up, but I've been remembering things about the night Key was taken." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "What kind of things?" "There was a man with the agents, well-dressed, nervous. He kept checking papers, mentioning payment schedules. I thought he was government, but—" Thomas turned back to her. "What if the child-taking system has more to it than just saving Indian children? What if there's money involved?" A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. "You mean selling children?" "Not selling, that would be too obvious, but placement fees. Donations to certain charities, kickbacks to cooperative officials." Thomas's face was grim. "It would explain why healthy children from loving families get taken while actual orphans languish in institutions." "That's monstrous." "That's business," Thomas corrected bitterly. "And if we could prove it, if we could show that Henry's placement was part of something corrupt, it would destroy Vanderbilt's moral high ground," Elizabeth finished. Hope sparked in her chest. "But how do we prove it?" Their investigation began quietly. Samuel Morse proved invaluable. His position at the telegraph office giving him access to message traffic. "Lots of wires between Vanderbilt and someone in Santa Fe," he reported. "Always in code. But the timing's interesting. Right around when children get relocated." Marie Curie used her education connections to request records from various institutions. "It's strange," she mused, studying the documents. "The paper trail for these children often goes cold. They're registered as arriving at schools or charities. But then, nothing." Florence Nightingale added her own disturbing observations. "I've treated several children who were supposedly orphaned in Indian raids that no one else seems to remember. Healthy children with no signs of trauma. Just taken." As they gathered evidence, life at the ranch continued its delicate balance. Thomas taught Henry to braid rope while Elizabeth watched from the porch, her mending forgotten in her lap. The boy's laughter rang across the yard as Thomas demonstrated how to make the strands dance. "You're staring," Thomas said without looking up. Elizabeth flushed. "I'm observing. There's a difference." "Is there?" His smile was gentle. Knowing, these moments of connection had become more frequent, more dangerous. The space between them seemed to shrink daily, despite their careful propriety. One evening, as autumn rain drummed on the roof, Henry asked the question they'd all been dreading. "Why don't some people like us being together?" Elizabeth and Thomas exchanged glances. They'd prepared for this, but the hurt in Henry's voice still cut deep. "Sometimes," Elizabeth said carefully, "people are afraid of things that look different from what they expect." "But we're a family," Henry protested. "Aren't we?" The word hung in the air, beautiful and terrifying. Thomas cleared his throat. "Families come in many forms. Little one, ours might not look like others, but what matters is how we care for each other. So we are a family, Henry pressed. Yes, Elizabeth said firmly, catching Thomas's eye. We are. The next morning brought troubling news. A wooden sign had been planted at their gate during the night, mixed blood, =mixed morals. The X carved below the words was crude but clear in its threat. Thomas pulled the sign down with controlled violence, but not before Henry saw it. The boy's face crumpled with confusion and hurt. What does it mean? He asked. It means some people are small and scared, Elizabeth said, pulling him close. And when people are scared, they sometimes do cruel things. That afternoon, unexpected support arrived. A delegation of Mexican ranchers, led by Diego Rivera, came to call. They'd heard about the court challenge and had their own stories to share. Vanderbilt tried the same with us. Diego explained, using the law to steal what he couldn't buy, we fought back. We'll stand with you. More allies emerged from surprising corners. The Chinese laundry owners, the freed slaves working the mines, even some of the smaller white ranchers who'd felt Vanderbilt's pressure. They formed an unlikely coalition, bound by shared experience of power wielded cruelly. 2 weeks before the hearing, Thomas made a breakthrough. He'd ridden to Fort Apache, calling in old favors from his scouting days. A sympathetic sergeant, Robert E. Lee, showed him records that civilian officials had tried to bury. Transport manifests, Lee explained quietly. Children moved like cargo, with bills of lading and everything. Your boys in here transferred to St. Mercy's Foundation with a payment of $50 to the procurement agent. Who signed for the payment? Lee's finger pointed to a name that made Thomas's blood run cold. Cornelius Vanderbilt. The night before the hearing, their small house was full. Allies had gathered to plan strategy, share information, offer support. Henry moved between them, refilling coffee cups with solemn importance. We have enough, Florence declared, reviewing their compiled evidence. The transport records, the financial connections, testimonies from other families. But will Judge Carnegie listen? Samuel worried. Vanderbilt's been courting him for years. Then we make it impossible for him not to, Elizabeth said. She looked around the room at these people who'd become their extended family. We tell the truth so loudly that silence becomes complicity. Later, after everyone had gone, Elizabeth found Thomas on the porch, staring at the stars. She sat beside him, closer than propriety allowed. Are you ready for tomorrow? She asked. I've been ready since the night they took him. His voice was soft but determined. The question is whether the world is ready to hear the truth. Thomas, Elizabeth hesitated, then plunged ahead. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know, these months have been, you've become. He turned to her, his dark eyes reflecting starlight. I know, he said simply. Me too. The space between them disappeared. For one moment, they weren't employer and employee, white woman and native man, but simply two people who'd found each other across impossible odds. Thomas's hand covered hers, warm and steady. After tomorrow, he promised. After we've won and Henry's safe, then we can talk about what comes next. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. After tomorrow, she agreed. Inside, Henry slept peacefully, unaware that his future hung in the balance, but he was surrounded by love, protected by a community that had formed around him like a living shield. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would not face it alone. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, but beneath them, two people sat in companionable silence, drawing strength from each other for the battle to come. The desert night wrapped around them like a blanket, and for these few hours before dawn, they allowed themselves to hope. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and oppressive, thunderclouds massing on the horizon like an omen. Elizabeth dressed with trembling hands, choosing her most conservative black dress. In the mirror, She looked like what she was, a widow fighting for her child. Thomas appeared at the kitchen door in his one good suit, borrowed from Samuel Morse and altered by the Chinese tailor. He'd tied his hair back severely, every inch the civilized Indian the court would expect. The sight of him trying so hard to fit their narrow definitions made Elizabeth's heart ache. "You look fine," she said softly. "I look like someone I'm not," he replied, tugging at the collar. "But if that's what it takes—" Henry sat between them on the wagon ride to town, unusually quiet. He wore his Sunday best, the clothes Elizabeth had sewn with such care. His small hand found Thomas's, then Elizabeth's, linking them together. "Will they make me leave?" he asked finally. "No," Thomas said firmly. "We won't let them." The courthouse was packed. It seemed half the territory had come to witness the spectacle. Vanderbilt sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, Jacob Astor, a sharp-faced man known for winning ugly cases. They radiated confidence, papers spread before them like weapons. Elizabeth's supporters clustered on one side, Diego Rivera and the Mexican ranchers, the Chinese merchants, Florence Nightingale, Marie Curie, and others who'd felt the weight of institutional power. On the other side sat Vanderbilt's faction, the established families who saw any change as a threat. Judge Andrew Carnegie entered, his face giving nothing away. He was known as a fair man, but also pragmatic. He understood which side his bread was buttered on. "This hearing will determine the fitness of Elizabeth Edison's household for the care of the minor child known as Henry," he intoned. "Mr. Astor, you may begin." Astor rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we're here today because of concerns about a deeply inappropriate situation. A widow, living with a man not her husband, raising a child in an environment of questionable morality." He painted a picture designed to shock the savage influencing an impressionable child, the flouting of social norms, the danger to both the boy's moral development and the community standards. He called witnesses who testified to seeing Thomas and Elizabeth working closely together, to the boy calling Thomas Pa. "And what message does this send?" Astor concluded dramatically. "That the sacred institution of marriage means nothing, that racial boundaries established by God and nature can be crossed with impunity. The child deserves better than this confusion." Elizabeth's lawyer, a young man named Oliver Wendell Holmes, whom Florence had found in Tucson, rose to cross-examine. He was green but passionate, and he'd worked tirelessly to prepare. "Mrs. Wellington," he addressed the store owner's wife, "you testified that you've seen Mr. Jefferson and Mrs. Edison working together. Did you ever witness any improper behavior?" "Well, no," Mrs. Wellington admitted. "But the appearance—" "Just answer the question, please. Any improper behavior?" "No." One by one, Holmes dismantled the morality arguments, showing them as smoke and prejudice, but everyone knew the real battle would come with Vanderbilt's testimony. The cattle baron took the stand with practiced ease. "I've been concerned about this situation from the start," he said, projecting paternal worry. "A child needs stability, proper guidance. What we have here is a makeshift arrangement that serves the adult's needs, not the child's." "And you're motivated purely by concern for the boy?" Holmes asked. "Of course." "Not by interest in Mrs. Edison's water rights?" Astor objected. "But the seed was planted." Holmes pressed on. "Mr. Vanderbilt, are you familiar with St. Mercy's Foundation?" A flicker of unease crossed Vanderbilt's face. "It's a charitable organization. I've made donations." Substantial donations, particularly around the times when Indian children were relocated through their programs. Holmes produced the documents Thomas had obtained. "Can you explain these payments marked procurement fees?" The courtroom stirred. Judge Carnegie frowned, leaning forward. This wasn't the direction anyone had expected. "I don't recall every donation," Vanderbilt said stiffly. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory." Holmes presented the transport manifest with Henry's name, Vanderbilt's signature authorizing payment. $50 for one child. What exactly were you purchasing, Mr. Vanderbilt? I wasn't purchasing anything. Vanderbilt's composure cracked. The foundation needed support for their work. Their work of taking children from their families and selling them to the highest bidder. The courtroom erupted. Carnegie gavelled for order. But the damage was done. The moral high ground had shifted like sand in a windstorm. Elizabeth took the stand next, her voice steady as she spoke of taking in a scared, lonely boy, of watching him bloom under Thomas's patient teaching and her own loving care, of building a family from broken pieces. It may not be conventional, she said, meeting the judge's eyes, but love rarely is. That boy has two people who would die for him, who are teaching him to be strong and kind and brave. How is that improper? Thomas testified last. Holmes had warned him to stick to facts, to not let emotion override strategy. But when asked about his relationship with Henry, Thomas's careful control slipped. They stole him from me, he said quietly. Men with papers and laws I didn't understand. For 2 years, I searched. Not a day passed that I didn't wonder if he was cold, or scared, or calling for me. His voice broke. Then I found him here, loved and cared for by this good woman. And we made a choice, all of us, to be a family. Not in the way others might approve, but in the way that keeps him safe and happy. And Mrs. Edison, Carnegie asked, what is she to you? Thomas looked at Elizabeth, and in that moment, the courtroom faded away. She's the woman who saved my son, who opened her home to a stranger, who stands against the world to protect what's right? He paused. She's my partner in raising this child. Anything else? That's tomorrow's question. The testimony continued, but the tide had turned. Diego Rivera spoke eloquently about communities supporting each other across racial lines. Florence Nightingale presented medical records showing Henry's excellent health and development. Marie Curie testified about his academic progress and social adjustment. But it was young Theodore Roosevelt who provided the most powerful moment. The banker's son marched to the stand, chin high despite his father's glare. Henry's my best friend, he declared. He teaches me things no one else knows, about the desert and the stars and being brave. His PA showed us how to help when Jimmy Chen got lost in the storm. His mom makes sure we all get fed when we play too long. He looked straight at the judge. They're good people. Better than some who look proper but act mean. Carnegie called a recess. The waiting was agony. Elizabeth, Thomas, and Henry sat together in the courthouse garden, surrounded by their makeshift community. No one spoke of the possibility of losing. When court reconvened, Carnegie looked tired. This case has raised issues far beyond one child's custody, he began. Evidence has been presented suggesting corruption in the very systems meant to protect children. That will require further investigation. Elizabeth's heart sank. Bureaucratic delays could mean months of uncertainty. However, Carnegie continued, the immediate question is the welfare of this child. The court has heard testimony about a household that, while unconventional, provides love, stability, and education. We've also heard evidence that those challenging this arrangement may have ulterior motives. He looked directly at Vanderbilt. Mr. Vanderbilt, I suggest you withdraw your petition. The revelations about St. Mercy's Foundation warrant investigation, and your involvement doesn't bear scrutiny. Vanderbilt's face went purple, but Astor whispered urgently in his ear. After a long moment, he stood. We withdraw the petition, he said through gritted teeth. Then it's the judgment of this court that Henry remain in the custody of Elizabeth Edison, with Thomas Jefferson recognized as a legal guardian. Carnegie's gavel came down with finality. Case dismissed. The courtroom exploded in celebration and outrage. Elizabeth felt her knees buckle, but Thomas was there, steady as always. Henry launched himself at both of them, and for a moment, they stood embracing in full view of everyone. Propriety be damned. Outside, their supporters surrounded them. Diego Rivera clasped Thomas's shoulder. "You fought well, hermano." "We all did," Thomas replied, but his eyes were on Elizabeth. As the crowd dispersed, Vanderbilt approached. His empire was intact, but his reputation had taken a beating. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "That water is not for sale," Elizabeth interrupted. "Not now, not ever. And if you come near my family again, we'll finish what we started today. There are more documents where those came from." Vanderbilt's jaw worked, but he had no response. He turned and stalked away, diminished. That evening, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before. But everything had changed. The threat was gone. Henry was safe. The careful walls they'd maintained could finally come down. "So," Elizabeth said softly, "tomorrow's questions." Thomas smiled, that rare, transformative expression. "I think we've earned the right to answer them." Henry, playing with his toy horses in the yard, looked up at them and grinned. "Does this mean Thomas doesn't have to sleep in the other house anymore?" Elizabeth blushed, but Thomas laughed. "One step at a time, little one." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Elizabeth felt the future spreading before them, full of possibility. It wouldn't be easy, nothing in the desert ever was, but they'd faced down the worst the world could throw at them and emerged stronger. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not giving up, for finding us, for staying." Thomas took her hand. There in the open, where anyone could see. "Thank you for giving me something to stay for." The night wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and its pack answered. The sound no longer seemed lonely, but rather a reminder that even in the vast desert, no one had to be alone. They'd built something from necessity that had transformed into choice, from arrangement into love, and tomorrow, finally, they could stop pretending it was anything less than what it had always been, a family. Unconventional and unbreakable, carved out of the harsh beauty of the frontier. The victory in court had lifted one weight, but danger still prowled the edges of their hard-won peace. 2 nights after the hearing, Elizabeth woke to Caesar's frantic barking. Through her window, she glimpsed shadows moving near the barn, too purposeful to be coyotes. Thomas materialized from the darkness like a wraith, rifle in hand. He'd seen them too, with practiced silence. He positioned himself between the intruders and the house. Elizabeth grabbed her shotgun and checked on Henry, who slept undisturbed. The barn door creaked open. By moonlight, she recognized Vanderbilt's foreman, John Rockefeller, and 2 hired guns. They were after something papers, maybe, or planning something worse. "Looking for something, gentlemen," Thomas's voice cut through the night. The men spun, hands reaching for weapons, but Thomas already had his rifle trained on them. "I'd think carefully about those next moves." "Just checking on stray cattle," Rockefeller said smoothly. "No harm meant?" "At 2 a.m, in my barn." Elizabeth emerged from the shadows, shotgun steady. "That's trespassing at best, theft at worst." The standoff stretched taut. Then hoofbeats thundered up the road. Diego Rivera and his sons, responding to a signal Thomas had sent, the Mexican ranchers formed a semicircle, rifles glinting. "Seems you're outnumbered," Diego observed mildly. "Best be moving along." Rockefeller's face twisted, but he knew when he was beaten. As they mounted their horses, he called back, "This ain't over. Vanderbilt, don't forget." After they left, Diego lingered. "They'll be back. Men like that, they can't stand losing." "Then we'll be ready," Thomas said, but Elizabeth knew they couldn't live under siege forever. The next morning, she made a decision. "We need to go on the offensive, find out what Vanderbilt's really afraid of." Their investigation deepened. Samuel Morse intercepted more telegrams, each more damning than the last. The child trafficking ring went deeper than they'd imagined, reaching into government offices and charitable institutions across the territory. Marie Curie used her education connections to trace paper trails. "Look at this," she said, spreading documents across Elizabeth's kitchen table. "Vanderbilt isn't just buying land. He's buying children's labor contracts. These adopted children end up working his mines and ranches." "Slavery by another name," Thomas said grimly. "And Henry would have been one of them," Elizabeth realized. "If I hadn't taken him in." Florence Nightingale added medical evidence. "I've treated dozens of these children, malnourished, overworked, some bearing marks of—" She couldn't finish. "We have to stop this." They formed a plan. Oliver Wendell Holmes would take their evidence to the territorial governor, but they needed one more piece proof of Vanderbilt's direct involvement. That proof came from an unexpected source. Clara Barton, the minister's wife who'd warned Elizabeth about appearances, arrived at the ranch one evening, clutching a valise. "I can't stand by anymore," she said, tears streaming. "My husband, he's been taking money, signing papers that say children are orphans when they're not. I've copied everything." The documents were damning. Lists of children, payment records, correspondence between Vanderbilt and corrupt officials. Most heartbreaking were the photographs children torn from families, labeled with prices like livestock. "Why?" Elizabeth asked. "Why come forward now?" Clara's voice broke. "I saw you three in court. How you fought for each other. It made me remember what's right." Thomas organized their allies for what came next. The Mexican ranchers, the Chinese merchants, the freed slaves all had suffered under Vanderbilt's schemes. United. They were formidable. The plan required precise timing. While Holmes took evidence to the governor, others would secure witness testimony. Thomas would lead a group to document conditions at Vanderbilt's operations where the trafficked children labored. "It's dangerous," Elizabeth protested as Thomas prepared to leave. "Everything worth doing is," he replied. He cupped her face gently. "Keep Henry safe. I'll be back." "You better be," she whispered fiercely. The next 3 days stretched like eternity. Elizabeth went through the motions teaching Henry, tending animals, maintaining normalcy, but her ears strained for hoofbeats. Her eyes searched the horizon. Henry sensed the tension. "Is Pa coming back?" he asked one evening. "Yes," Elizabeth said firmly. "He always comes back to us." On the third night, thunder rolled across the desert. Not a storm, horses. Many horses. Elizabeth grabbed her rifle, heart pounding, but then she heard Diego's distinctive whistle. Thomas swung down from his horse, exhausted but triumphant. "We got it, all of it." He carried a leather satchel full of documents, photographs, testimonies. "The governor's issuing warrants. It's over." But Vanderbilt wasn't finished. The next morning, he arrived at the ranch with a dozen armed men. Elizabeth met them on the porch, Thomas beside her, their neighbors gathering behind. "You've destroyed everything I've built." Vanderbilt snarled. "Years of work, gone." "You built it on children's backs," Elizabeth replied steadily. "It deserved to fall." Vanderbilt's hand moved toward his gun. "Maybe I can't win in court, but there's older justice." "I wouldn't." The voice came from behind Vanderbilt. William Sherman, the territorial marshal, sat his horse with quiet authority. "Mr. Vanderbilt, I have a warrant for your arrest. Trafficking, fraud, conspiracy. Come quietly, or don't. Your choice." For a moment, violence trembled in the air. Then Vanderbilt's shoulders sagged. His empire, built on others' misery, had crumbled. Sherman's deputies led him away in chains. "It's really over," Elizabeth breathed. "This part is," Thomas agreed. "Now we build something better." The following weeks brought changes. Children who'd been trapped in Vanderbilt's schemes were reunited with families or found real homes. The corrupt network fell apart as officials scrambled to save themselves. At the ranch, life settled into new rhythms, without the threat hanging over them. Elizabeth and Thomas could finally acknowledge what had grown between them. The careful distance dissolved, replaced by easy affection. One evening, as they worked side by side fixing the chicken coop, Henry piped up, "When are you getting married?" Elizabeth nearly hammered her thumb. "Henry." "What? Theodore's parents are married. Diego and Maria are married." "You love each other, don't you?" Thomas and Elizabeth exchanged glances out of the mouths of babes. "It's complicated, little one," Thomas said carefully. "Why?" Henry's 6-year-old logic was relentless. "You live here. You take care of us. Ma smiles when she looks at you. You smile when you look at her. That's what married people do." That night, after Henry was asleep, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before. But now Thomas's arm was around Elizabeth's shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "He's not wrong," Thomas said quietly. "No," Elizabeth agreed. "He's not." "It won't be easy. There are laws." "There are ways around them. Other territories where the laws are different." Elizabeth turned to face him. "I'm tired of living for what others think. We've proven we're stronger together." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, pulling her up with him. In the tradition of his people, he spoke formally. "Elizabeth Edison, you saved my son. You gave us home and hope. Would you honor me by joining your path with mine?" "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Thomas." They were married twice, once by Reverend Franklin in a ceremony the town could recognize, and once in the desert at sunrise, with Thomas's cousin performing the traditional rites. Henry stood between them for both, beaming. The ranch prospered. With the water rights secure and Vanderbilt's monopoly broken, small farmers could thrive. Elizabeth and Thomas expanded carefully, bringing in milk cows to supplement the goats, planting orchards that would bear fruit for generations. Henry grew strong and clever, moving easily between worlds. At school, he was Henry Jefferson Edison, star pupil. At home, he was also Ki Yazi, learning the old stories and skills. He carried both names with pride. The town, forced to confront its prejudices during the trial, slowly changed. When Elizabeth and Thomas walked down Main Street with Henry between them, most people nodded respectfully. Some even smiled. "We did it," Elizabeth said one evening, watching Henry help Thomas with the evening milking. "We made a family." "We made more than that," Thomas replied. "We made a place where different worlds can meet, where love matters more than law." As if to underscore his point, a group of children ran past Theodore Roosevelt, Jimmy Chen, Maria Rivera, and others, chasing fireflies without thought to the differences their parents saw. Henry joined them, his laughter bright in the gathering dusk. "That's the future," Elizabeth said softly. "Right there." Thomas pulled her close. "Then we've built something worth keeping." The stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had watched over Thomas's desperate search, Elizabeth's lonely grief, and Henry's frightening journey. Now they shone on something new, a family forged in adversity, strengthened by choice and bound by love deeper than blood or law. In the morning, there would be chores and challenges, the endless work of frontier life. But tonight, they were complete. The warrior who'd traded his last arrow had found more than milk he'd found home. The widow who'd opened her door to a stranger had discovered that broken hearts could heal stronger than before. And the boy with 2 names had what every child deserved, parents who would fight the world to keep him safe. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of rain and promise. And in a small ranch house where 3 souls had become one family, all was well. The seasons turned gently over the desert, painting the landscape in subtle shifts of color and light. A year had passed since the trial, since Vanderbilt's empire crumbled. Since Elizabeth and Thomas had spoken their vows under both roof and stars, the ranch had transformed from a struggle for survival into something approaching prosperity. Thomas had proven gifted with the cattle, introducing techniques learned from his years of observation. The herd grew healthy and strong, their calves fetching good prices at market. Elizabeth's dairy business expanded too. What started with goat milk now included cheese, butter, and cream that travelers sought out specially. Henry thrived between his two worlds. Mornings found him at the kitchen table, Elizabeth guiding his hand through multiplication tables and the mysteries of grammar. Afternoons belonged to Thomas, learning to read the sky for weather, to gentle a spooked horse, to find water where others saw only dry land. "He's getting tall," Florence Nightingale observed during one of her visits. She'd taken to stopping by monthly, ostensibly to check Henry's health, but really to enjoy their company. "Must be the good food and all that sunshine." "And love," Elizabeth added quietly. "That helps too." The wider community had evolved as well. The exposure of Vanderbilt's trafficking ring had sparked territorial reforms. Marie Curie now headed a commission ensuring Indian children could maintain family connections while receiving education. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Samuel Morse brought news from his telegraph office. "They're talking about statehood again. Maybe 5, 10 years. Things will change then," Thomas said thoughtfully. He was repairing harness leather, his hands steady on the familiar work. "Some things," Elizabeth agreed, "but not the important ones." Their partnership had deepened into something neither had quite expected. The careful business arrangement had long since given way to genuine intimacy. Thomas no longer slept in the foreman's cabin, though they'd kept it ready for appearances when necessary. One evening, as purple twilight settled over the desert, Elizabeth found herself watching Thomas teach Henry to weave a traditional water basket. Their heads bent together, dark and darker, hands moving in patient rhythm. "The reeds must be soaked just right," Thomas explained. "Too wet and they break, too dry and they won't bend." "Like people," Henry said seriously, making his father laugh. "Exactly like people, little philosopher." These quiet moments were Elizabeth's treasures. After years of loneliness, her house rang with voices, footsteps, life. Even the challenges, and there were many, felt manageable when faced together. The challenges came in various forms, despite the legal victories. Prejudice didn't disappear overnight. There were still cold shoulders in town, whispered comments. The occasional anonymous note slipped under their door. One market day, Elizabeth overheard Harriet Beecher at the general store. "It's unnatural, that's what it is. That poor child, growing up confused about his place in the world." Elizabeth set down her basket with deliberate calm. "Mrs. Beecher, Henry knows exactly his place. He's loved, educated, and learning skills that will serve him well. Can all parents say the same?" The woman huffed but had no reply. Elizabeth gathered her purchases. Head high, she'd learned that dignity and success were the best responses to small minds. Not all encounters were hostile. Many in town had come to respect what they'd built. Diego Rivera often brought his children to play, creating a joyful chaos of languages and laughter. The Chinese merchants taught Henry basic accounting in exchange for Thomas's help with their horses. "We're creating something new," Thomas said one night as they lay together, listening to coyotes sing. "Not white, not Indian, but something in between." "A bridge," Elizabeth suggested. "That's what we are, a bridge between worlds." The test of that bridge came when Thomas's relatives arrived unexpectedly. 3 riders appeared at sunset: his cousin Joseph, Joseph's wife Mary, and their daughter Sarah, about Henry's age. Elizabeth felt a flutter of anxiety. Thomas had spoken of his family, but meeting them was different. Would they accept her? Would they think Thomas had betrayed his heritage? Her fears proved unfounded. Mary embraced her warmly. "You saved his child," she said simply. "That makes you family." Over the next days, Elizabeth watched Henry soak up this new dimension of his heritage. Sarah taught him games. Joseph told stories that made the boy's eyes widen with wonder. Thomas translated, his face more relaxed than she'd ever seen it. "I want to learn more words." Henry announced at dinner. "Sarah says I sound funny when I try to speak Navajo." "You'll learn," Joseph assured him. "The tongue remembers what the heart knows." The visit culminated in a ceremony Elizabeth couldn't fully understand, but felt in her bones. They blessed the house, the land, the union that had seemed impossible. Henry received a traditional name, Bidzil, meaning he who is strong. "2 names weren't enough," Elizabeth teased gently. "A person needs as many names as the paths they walk," Mary explained. "This one is for the path between worlds." After the relatives left, promising to return, the ranch felt both emptier and fuller. Henry peppered them with questions about his extended family, about traditions, about belonging to multiple places at once. "It's like being a river," Thomas told him one night as they watched stars. "You flow from one place to another, carrying parts of both, creating something new." The metaphor seemed to satisfy Henry, who fell asleep planning all the things he'd show Sarah when she visited again. Elizabeth and Thomas's relationship had evolved into something that surprised them both with its depth. The initial spark of attraction had matured into profound partnership. They balanced each other, her quick mind and education, complementing his practical wisdom and deep knowledge of the land. "I never expected this," Elizabeth confessed one morning as they worked side by side in the garden. "When James died, I thought my chance at happiness was over. And I thought I'd lost everything when they took Key." Thomas replied, "But the desert teaches patience. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning." They'd learned each other's rhythms. Elizabeth knew Thomas needed solitude sometimes, would disappear into the desert for hours and return centered. Thomas understood Elizabeth's fierce need to prove herself capable, never stepping in unless asked. Their love had a quality of choice about it that made it stronger. They'd come together not from blind passion or social expectation, but from conscious decision renewed daily. The ranch prospered under their joint management. They'd added a small orchard, apples and peaches that would take years to bear fruit, but represented faith in the future. The vegetable garden expanded, providing not just for their table but surplus to sell. One day, William McKinley, the territorial administrator, visited with a proposal. "We're establishing a new school, one that serves all children regardless of background. We need board members who understand different communities." Elizabeth and Thomas exchanged glances. "Both of us?" Elizabeth asked. "Both of you. Times are changing, slowly but surely. We need people who've already built bridges to help others cross." They accepted, adding another dimension to their busy lives. The school became a model, drawing students from Mexican, Chinese, Native, and Anglo families. Henry thrived there, moving easily between groups, translating more than just languages. As autumn approached, Elizabeth realized she'd missed her monthly time. Florence confirmed her suspicions with a knowing smile. "About 7 months along, I'd say." The news transformed their household. Thomas's joy was quiet but profound. Expressed in the cradle, he began crafting with meticulous care. Henry oscillated between excitement and worry about sharing his parents. "You'll be a wonderful big brother," Elizabeth assured him. "Think of all you can teach." "Both names?" Henry asked. "Both languages?" "Everything you know and more," Thomas promised. The pregnancy wasn't easy. Elizabeth was older now, the heat harder to bear, but she had support Florence's medical knowledge, Mary's wisdom from her visits, the community of women who'd once shunned her now bringing remedies and advice. Thomas hovered, protective to the point of comedy. "I've birthed calves and foals," Elizabeth reminded him in exasperation. "I think I can manage walking to the hen house." "Those weren't carrying my child," he replied stubbornly. "The baby came with the first snow." Unusual for the desert, but fitting for a child who would bridge worlds. A daughter. With Elizabeth's determined chin and Thomas's dark eyes, they named her Rose, for Elizabeth's grandmother, and Dolly, meaning bluebird in Navajo. Henry held his sister with reverent care. "She's so small," he whispered. "Was I this small?" "Smaller," Thomas said, "but just as perfect." As Elizabeth recovered, lying in bed with her daughter at her breast, her son reading quietly beside her, her husband keeping watch, she marveled at the journey. From a widow alone on a failing ranch to this a family that defied convention but defined love. "No regrets?" Thomas asked softly, reading her mood as he often did. "None," Elizabeth said firmly. "Not one." Outside, snow continued to fall, transforming the desert into something magical. The goats huddled in their shelter. The cattle stood patient and enduring. In the house that had once echoed with loneliness, a new voice added to the chorus of belonging. They'd built more than a successful ranch, more than a legal precedent, more than a bridge between communities. They'd created a place where love mattered more than law, where identity could be multiple without being divided, where the future had room for all kinds of families. As night deepened, they gathered close 4 souls who'd found each other across impossible odds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new growth, new possibilities. But tonight, with snow falling soft as blessings and their daughter's first cries announcing her place in the world, they were simply, completely home. The warrior who'd traded his last arrow for milk had received so much more in return. And the desert, which had witnessed so much sorrow, now cradled a joy as vast as its starred sky, as enduring as its ancient stones. Dawn broke gentle and golden over the ranch, painting the red earth in shades of copper and rose. Elizabeth stood on the porch, baby Rose cradled in her arms, watching the sunrise transform the desert into something magical. 5 years had passed since that first sandstorm brought Thomas to her door, and the landscape of their lives had changed as dramatically as the seasons. The ranch had grown into a proper operation. Where once stood a struggling homestead now spread a thriving enterprise. The small trading post Thomas had built by the gate had become a regular stop for travelers, offering fresh milk, cheese, eggs, and supplies. The sign above it read, "Arrow and Milk Trading Post." Henry's idea, one that made them all smile. "Mama, look," Henry called from the corral, where he was working with a young colt. At 11, he'd grown tall and capable, moving with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. "Watch him follow me." The colt indeed trotted after Henry like an oversized puppy, responding to the boy's patient training. Thomas stood nearby, pride evident in his bearing as he supervised his son's work. "You've taught him well," Elizabeth called to her husband. "He teaches himself," Thomas replied. "We just provide the opportunities." Rose, now 4, squirmed to be let down. The moment her feet touched ground, she ran toward the chicken coop, dark braids bouncing. "Eggs," she announced importantly. "My turn to gather eggs." Elizabeth followed, smiling at her daughter's determination. Rose had inherited her father's quiet strength and her mother's fierce independence, a combination that promised interesting years ahead. The morning routine unfolded with practiced harmony. Henry finished with the horses and joined his sister at the chicken coop, helping her reach the higher nests. Thomas and Elizabeth worked together in the dairy barn, their movements synchronized from years of partnership. "Samuel telegraphed yesterday," Thomas said as they worked. "The railroad's definitely coming through, maybe 2 years out." Elizabeth paused in her milking. The railroad would change everything, bring new opportunities, but also new challenges. "We'll adapt," she said finally. "We always do." "Always," Thomas agreed, but she heard the concern beneath his confidence. Later, as the sun climbed higher, visitors arrived. Marie Curie drove up in her buggy. accompanied by a young woman Elizabeth didn't recognize. "Elizabeth, Thomas," Marie greeted warmly. "I'd like you to meet Helen Keller. She's establishing a new program for children with special needs, including those from Native families who struggle in traditional schools." Helen was earnest and passionate, speaking rapidly about her plans. "We need people who understand different ways of learning, different ways of being in the world. Marie tells me you've built something special here." They toured the property, Helen observing how naturally Henry switched between English and Navajo, how Rose absorbed both languages like sunshine. She watched Thomas teach traditional weaving while Elizabeth worked on the account books, each respecting the other's domain. "Would you consider hosting students?" Helen asked finally. "Children who need to see that there's more than one way to succeed." Elizabeth and Thomas exchanged glances, conducting one of their wordless conversations. "We'd be honored," Elizabeth said, as their guests departed, promising to return with more details. Henry approached with a question that had clearly been brewing. "Ma, Pa, why don't I look like either of you completely?" They'd known this day would come. Elizabeth had rehearsed various responses, but Thomas spoke first, his voice gentle. "Sit with us, son." They gathered on the porch steps, Rose climbing into Elizabeth's lap. Thomas chose his words carefully. "You know how rivers are formed, different streams coming together?" Henry nodded, attentive. "You're like that. You have the blood of my people, the Dine, strong, enduring, connected to this land for countless generations. But you also carry other streams, the peoples who came to this land more recently, bringing their own strengths. And we," Elizabeth added, "your father and I, we chose to be your parents. Not because of blood, but because of love. Family isn't just about looking alike. It's about choosing each other every day." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then, "So I'm like the ranch, different parts coming together to make something new." "Exactly." Thomas smiled. "And just like the ranch, you're stronger for it." Rose, not to be left out, piped up, "I look like everybody." The simple statement, delivered with 4-year-old certainty, broke any remaining tension. They laughed, the sound carrying across the desert like a blessing. The afternoon brought its own rhythms. Elizabeth worked on correspondence orders for their products now came from as far as California. The reputation of Arrow and Milk Ranch had spread, their success story inspiring other mixed families to persevere. She paused over a letter from Oliver Wendell Holmes, now a prominent lawyer in Phoenix. He wrote of ongoing reforms, of children reunited with families, of gradual changes in laws and hearts. "Your courage started something," he wrote. "The ripples continue to spread." Outside, she heard Thomas working with a group of young men from the reservation, teaching them cattle management skills. It was part of their expanding mission, sharing knowledge, building bridges, creating opportunities. "Mrs. Edison," a voice called from the gate. George Washington Carver stood there, dusty from travel. The agricultural scientist had been touring the territory, studying desert farming techniques. "Professor Carver, welcome." Elizabeth hurried to greet him. "Thomas will be so pleased he's been experimenting with your soil improvement methods." Over dinner, conversation flowed like water after rain. Carver shared innovations. The children peppered him with questions, and plans were made for future collaboration. This was what Elizabeth loved most, their table as a gathering place for minds and hearts from all backgrounds. As evening approached, they prepared for their weekly tradition. Every Saturday, neighboring families gathered for what had become known as the Arrow and Milk Social. It had started small, just the Riveras and a few others. Now, dozens came, bringing food, music, and fellowship. The yard filled with voices in multiple languages. Children ran between the adults, playing games that borrowed from various traditions. Musicians brought guitars, fiddles, drums, creating a sound uniquely Western yet wholly new. Elizabeth watched Henry lead a group of younger children in a game Sarah had taught him, while Rose commanded attention with a story told in dramatic gestures when words in any language failed her. Thomas stood with the men, discussing the railroad's impact, but his eyes found hers across the crowd, warm with shared contentment. "You've built something beautiful," Florence Nightingale said, joining Elizabeth. The doctor had aged gracefully, her hair silver now, but her spirit undimmed. "We all built it," Elizabeth corrected. "Every person here contributed." As the sun set, painting the gathering in golden light, Reverend Franklin called for attention. "Friends, we gather on land that has seen sorrow and joy, division and unity. What Elizabeth and Thomas have created here, what we've all helped create, is a vision of what's possible when we choose love over fear." "Hear, hear," voices called out. Thomas stepped forward, Elizabeth joining him, their children naturally gravitating to their sides. "When I came here," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "I was looking for one thing, my son. What I found was so much more: family, community, hope." "And when I opened my door to a stranger," Elizabeth added, "I thought I was just offering water to a thirsty man. Instead, I was opening my life to possibilities I never imagined." Old Sam, the Chinese elder, raised his cup to bridges built with arrow and milk. The toast echoed across the gathering, cups raised high. In that moment, with the desert painted in sunset colors and hearts united in celebration, the vision was complete. Later, after guests had departed and children were tucked in bed, Elizabeth and Thomas sat on their porch as they had so many nights before, but now the silence between them was rich with shared history, comfortable as a well-worn blanket. "Do you ever think about how different it might have been?" Elizabeth asked. "If you'd gone to another ranch that day." Thomas pulled her closer. "Every path I might have taken led here," he said with certainty. "The spirits knew what they were doing when that sandstorm drove me to your door." "I'll trade my last arrow for milk," Elizabeth quoted softly, smiling at the memory. "Best trade you ever made." "Best trade we ever made," Thomas corrected. "You gave as much as you got." A coyote called in the distance, answered by another. Then another, a wild chorus that no longer sounded lonely, but like the desert itself singing. The stars emerged one by one, ancient witnesses to all the small human dramas played out beneath them. In the house, their children slept peacefully, dreaming dreams that could encompass multiple worlds without contradiction. The ranch spread around them, testament to what could be built when people chose courage over convention, love over law. "What now?" Elizabeth asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Now," Thomas smiled in the darkness. "Now we keep building, keep teaching, keep proving that there's room in this vast land for all kinds of families, all kinds of love." "Together," Elizabeth said. "Always together," Thomas confirmed. As midnight approached, they finally went inside, checking on the children one last time before seeking their own rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: the railroad, changing laws, evolving communities. But it would also bring new opportunities to demonstrate that the American dream had room for many dreamers, many voices, many ways of being family. The warrior who had traded his last arrow for milk had received an empire of the heart. The widow who had opened her door to a stranger had discovered that love could bloom even in the harshest desert. And the children who carried multiple names would grow up knowing that identity wasn't about choosing one path, but about walking confidently at the intersection of many. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying stories of transformation, and in a ranch that had become a beacon, 4 hearts beat as one. Proof that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most unlikely seeds, watered with tears of sorrow and joy alike, reaching always toward the light. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, courage, and family in the Wild West. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and exchange our thoughts about this tale. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help more people discover this story of how love conquered all odds in the American frontier. Until next time, partners.